Do you deny this, Moros?
I do not deny anything.
A guard slammed his boot into the snow and pulled. The prisoner's coat snagged, then tore, and the man's thin shoulder scraped across as the cluster of prisoners in the yard pushed back from the perimeter line. Fear sat under the narrator's ribs like a physical weight. He marked its presence in his notebook and let the fact of fear determine his next steps. From the first scrape of fabric on frozen ground, the central problem was clear. Systematic starvation and exposure had become the camp's mechanism of control. The narrator watched without intervening. He wrote with a small, cold nib, noting the guard's badge number, the prisoner's gait, the angle of the fall. He had been here to document patterns, not to protest, and he kept to that brief, to collect facts until the facts themselves would indict. The yard was pre-dawn. Breath smoked in the air. Men shifted where they stood. A row of boots, a hollowed cheek, the way a man's fingers flexed around nothing, such details would be his evidence. Sokolov, the narrator said, once low, and the guard looked up as if surprised to be named in a sentence that was not an order. The guard's face did not change. Guard Sokolov spat into the snow and hooked his hand under the prisoner's arm. Move, Sokolov. The word landed as a command, and the prisoner stumbled forward. The narrator kept his distance. He recorded the prisoner's name when someone offered it. Ivan, he wrote the time. He wrote the way leather squeaked against frozen fabric. He did not write pity. He wrote what could be proven. This emphasis on demonstration, what could be shown rather than what must be felt, produced two early emotional shifts. Suspicion when he first arrived, then a deeper fear that the system was intentional. Inside the barrack later, the narrator opened a battered survivor log with hands that smelled of cold paper and oily candle smoke. Barrack elder Mikhail set the book on a splintered table and tapped a name with a knuckle. The room smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Men huddled on narrow bunks with soup bowls gone to plate rims. Bones pressed the blankets thin. Mikhail's finger left a ring of grey on the page. Look, Mikhail. He pointed at a column of dates and numbers. 20 gone that month. They wrote 6 and buried 20. The narrator read aloud the ledger's headings and the falsified ration numbers. He kept his voice steady. Who kept the official sheets? He asked. Dr. Petrov signs them. Mikhail. Petrov signs and the feeding goes down. Mikhail's speech was flat. He did not beg. He did not plead. He gave the narrator specifics, names, dates, the wooden crate numbers where bread was recorded but absent. That factual list shifted the narrator's stance from fear to a tight, clinical outrage. He did not scream. He organized. That organization was his form of resistance. The next morning, in the punishment yard, the narrator watched a public beating. Alexandr had been found with a small roll of bread tucked into his sleeve. Guards dragged him into the center of the yard. A circle formed. Sokolov removed his gloves and folded them at his belt like an instrument being readied. Stand, Sokolov. Alexandr did not resist. He could not. He was thin to the point of hollowness. The guard stepped forward and hit him with the flat of a hand. The sound snapped clean through the air. Alexandra's jaw shifted. He coughed. A small spatter of blood landed on the snow. Alexandra, someone hissed. Alexander, save yourself. Alexandra blinked slow and said, I had 2 bites. Sokolov struck again. The narrator recorded the beats, the timing, the exact words. He watched the other men's faces. Some averted eyes, some watched with fixed, measured attention. The beating was not merely punishment. It was performance, an engineered message that starvation would be enforced by spectacle. This brought another shift in the narrator's feeling toward clarity. The cruelty was ritualized, designed to sustain obedience. In the infirmary, the narrator confronted Dr. Petrov. The room smelled of boiled liniment and disinfectant that had long since lost effect. Petrov looked younger than the ledger suggested. His hands were clean and precise. He closed the door behind him and set a paper file on a metal tray. "Dr. Petrov," the narrator said, and he placed the original ration sheet in the center of the tray. Petrov's eyes flicked across the figures. "This is sealed," he said. "Sealed how?" the narrator asked. Petrov's voice flattened. "Orders from above." He tapped the margin of the sheet with one fingertip. "Sign here." The narrator watched Petrov's knuckles. He watched the way the doctor avoided looking directly at the names. He who gave the orders. Petrov stared at his own hands. "I sign. I do not read beyond my line." Petrov's refusal was not denial. It was a practiced detachment. The narrator pressed harder. "You falsified rations on official forms," he said. "Supply is what arrives," Petrov answered. "Paper says otherwise." That exchange exposed another pivot, from suspicion to a kind of cold comprehension that responsibility had been parceled out to avoid accountability. The narrator recorded Petrov's phrasing and the slight tremor in his voice when he said the word supply. That tremor was a concrete action, a leak in the doctor's armor. Evening would bring a different reveal. Behind the supply shed, Mikhail dug with his bare hands until his knuckles went raw. He had a small lantern and a shovel with one chewed edge. He produced a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The narrator watched the oilcloth peel back to reveal names written in several hands, not all neat, some cramped and overwritten. Mikhail read aloud. "Nikolai Petrov, died December 7th. Burial not logged." He struck the page with his fist. "They log 6. They bury 20. You bury them where?" The narrator asked. Mikhail pointed at a place beyond the shed where the snow carried fewer tracks, and a low mound rose like a small hill. "There, Mikhail." They walked. The narrator noted the sound of their boots against crusted snow and the distance between them. The mound had scattered personal items. A button, a rosary bead without its cross, a cracked tin cup. Mikhail crouched and picked up the cup, fingers closing where frost had taken hold. He did not speak for a long moment. "That is proof," Mikhail finally. "Outside their ledger, outside the books." The narrator photographed the cup with his memory. He wrote details of the rosary bead, the button, the way the soil under the snow had been turned. This discovery altered the chapter's direction. It turned isolated observations into a concrete count, a ledger against another ledger. It forced a further shift. Fear hardened into a resolve to preserve evidence. A work detail on the frozen lake escalated the tension. Prisoners hauled planks across a sheet of white. The wind bit at exposed faces. A man named Ivan, the same dragged across the yard earlier, faltered and collapsed under the load. The line stopped. Men glanced at one another. Sokolov barked an order. Voices rose. "Carry him," Sokolov ordered. "No," a prisoner muttered. "Bring him up, Sokolov." Then he turned to Ivan and said, "Get up." Ivan pushed with 2 fingers and could not lift his weight. Mikhail stepped forward and said, "We can pull him to the sled." Ivan whispered, "I can't." Sokolov's hand closed on a club. "Then you die here," he said. There followed 3 rapid lines of back and forth. Mikhail demanding a moment to help, Sokolov refusing, and one of the other prisoners calling, "Sokolov, watch the other men." That short dispute showed clear positions. Mikhail attempting to preserve life, Sokolov enforcing the mandate. The narrator recorded words, times, and the precise sequence of orders. The argument ended with Sokolov striking the ground with his club to break the attempt. Men resumed hauling planks. Ivan lay curled on the ice. That scene contained the second mini cliffhanger. The narrator closed the notebook and moved to the front of the line. He placed his palm on Ivan's shoulder and felt how thin the man had become. A single question. Who gives the leave orders? No one answers that. Mikhail. This refusal to answer was a hinge. It suggested the presence of an unseen chain of command. The narrator decided then to press beyond recordings into confrontation. He would not simply note. He would force an explicit trace of authority. Dawn brought the forced march across open snow. The wind was a blade and a horizon of white offered no shelter. The group moved single, File under guards with rifles slung at ease. Ivan's feet dragged. The man's breath left a thin thread in the air and then less. Halfway across the field, he stumbled and fell forward into a drift. He could not push up. Sokolov slowed, then barked to the officers. They clustered for a brief talk. The prisoners watched. Mikhail moved forward and grabbed at Ivan's sleeve. "We take him back, Mikhail." Sokolov stepped between them. "No," he said. "Orders are orders." Mikhail's voice rose. "Sokolov, you cannot leave him." Sokolov's reply was short. "We leave him." 3 guards spread out like a ring. The narrator recorded the time and the guard positions with a precise, methodical hand. He wrote the words exchanged. He wrote the sound of snow being pushed aside by boots. Ivan's lips made no sound. Mikhail tried to pull him to his feet. Guard struck Mikhail with a rifle butt. "Don't touch him, Sokolov." Mikhail fell back, hands open. He spat out, "You will carry this." "Quiet, Sokolov." The guards shoved the prisoners to continue. A figure in the line looked back once and then bent forward again. Ivan's body sank into the drift. The narrator counted steps as the group walked on. 30, 60, 90. He described in his notebook how the wind filled the fallen man's mouth with snow until it muffled even the attempt to call out. The moment the party passed beyond the mound of white, a sound reached them, not a scream but a small, muffled exhalation that ceased. Mikhail stopped. He turned his face away for a second and then spat blood into the snow. The narrator wrote the detail. The blood fell and struck the crust like dark loam. That was the chapter's climax. It was the emotional and visual peak. After the march, the narrator did not sleep. He returned to the barrack with the hidden ledger and a thin candle. He copied names into his notebook. The same names that had been struck from official sheets, the same numbers that did not match the buried cup outside the shed. He wrote line after line to make a trace that would not be denied. Mikhail sat opposite him and watched without interruption. "You will make them read this, Mikhail." The narrator closed the notebook and tapped it with 2 fingers. He did not promise. He recorded instead a plan. To submit the ledger to higher command, to place copies in safe hands. He listed the names of men who could carry it beyond the camp, men with contacts in the railworks and a former clerk who once worked in a distant town. Night moved through the barrack in measured moments. A creak of bunks, the scrape of a spoon, the cough of someone sleeping fitfully. Men whispered names and dates into the dark like ritual. Mikhail murmured the same few lines he had said earlier and then went silent. The narrator penned one final entry for the night. The time, the gate watch number, the weather, and a description of the burial mound, down to the rosary bead's missing cross. The chapter did not end in consolation. It ended with action. The narrator rose, folded the oilcloth around the hidden ledger, and handed it to Mikhail with careful fingers. "Carry this to the clerk on the 3rd shift," he said. Mikhail nodded and left through the side door. He walked into the night, with the ledger wrapped against his chest, and the rosary bead folded into his palm. The narrator watched him go until the lantern swallowed him. Then he turned back to the cold table, opened his notebook one more time, and wrote a final line. The date, the list of names, and the single, concrete promise that would bind his work to consequence. He would file these pages where they could be traced. Outside on the white field, the body of Ivan lay where it had been left. The snow had begun to crust over the places the men had walked. The narrator did not write a flourish. He recorded the temperature, the direction of the wind, and the fact that a rosary bead had been left by the grave. He noted the last spoken words he had heard in the field. Mikhail's, thrown after the group as they trudged away. "We remember you," Mikhail had said, and the narrator put those words into a concrete sentence in his notes. The chapter resolves with that exchange. A ledger kept hidden, a body left in the field, and a man tasked to carry evidence out of the camp. The narrator's emotions moved from suspicion to fear, then to focused resolve. Mikhail's actions created both moral pressure and a new path for the record to travel. The chapter closes on Mikhail's silhouette receding into the snow, while the narrator sits under a single candle and secures the copy in his notebook. The act itself the promise that the names would not vanish into official numbers. This is the record of the frozen yard sequence. A drag across ice, a beaten man's blood on the snow, falsified rations, a hidden ledger, a skipped burial, and the deliberate choice by two men to make the hidden visible. The final line of the night is a practical one. The ledger leaves the barrack with Mikhail at 200 hours, and the narrator will wait for proof that the clerk receives it. The chapter ends with an immediate action. Mikhail steps through the gate and vanishes down the road, not with a reflection, but with a clear, concrete movement that sets the next events in motion. A man falls at the hatch. He drops the single crust and folds inward on himself, fingers curled around the bread like a plea. Men shove past him. A guard curses and kicks his shoulder so the prisoner rolls and the crust skids under a thawed plank. Fear threads the queue. People pull back with measured steps. That fear, a tightness behind the throat and the quick clench of fists, pushes the narrator forward into the hole of bodies and cold breath. The narrator writes fear into the first line. He had watched similar panic before. Guards had kicked a man across the frozen yard, tearing his coat until a shoulder bled under the ice. He notes the old yard memory in his notebook like a tally. The central problem is immediate and visible. Bread is missing, and men will either hide their crumbs or fight for life. The kitchen door stands open where the ration hatch opens each morning, and a ledger sits on a shelf high enough that only the foreman reaches it without ladder or favor. Move, Sergeant Moroz snaps. No lingering. Sergeant, he's down. Ludmila calls, voice raw. Old Pavel stoops. He drags the crust toward the fallen man and hands it across the plank. His fingers tremble. Ludmila grips his sleeve. The narrator steps up to the hatch and sees a kitchen foreman with flour on his palms and a ledger under his arm. The foreman's eyes avoid the crowd. The narrator's purpose, to record and to expose, pushes him to demand the ledger. He reaches, places his hand flat on the wooden lip, and says, "Show the ledger." The foreman's jaw tightens. The crowd breathes as if waiting for a verdict. "Where's the ledger?" a prisoner asks. The foreman lifts the book too quickly. A page flops. A smear of grease and the faint scrape of a pencil mark in a column. The narrator turns pages with nails that collect grit. Lines of names and numbers repeat. Portions have faint erasures, cross-outs that do not match the ink beside them. The first emotion shift arrives not as a thought but as a movement in the crowd, suspicion to anger. A young man spits. "They lie," he says. "Who lies?" Sergeant Moroz asks. He is the one who keeps order by force. His breath smokes. Moroz's gloves are thick. His baton is thick in his palm. He stands between the queue and the hatch like a hinge. Old Pavel says nothing. He presses his palms to his chest where his ribs show through wool. His mouth leaves a dry line. He does not plead. He watches the ledger as if it might bite him. The narrator asks the kitchen foreman aloud about the tallies and the weight measurements. The foreman stammers, naming dates, then a guard's code, then a number that does not match the flour sacks stacked behind him. "We counted wrong," he says. His voice breaks on the word wrong. That admission widens the crowd's anger. Ludmila leans forward and says, "You stole from us." Her voice is small but clear. A man in the back coughs. Ivan, a young prisoner, mutters, "We were promised full rations. We starve." His fingers are raw. His wrists show repeated scars. The second emotion shift threads through the group. Anger sharpens into fear as the numbers on the page reveal a pattern. The ledger shows repeated shortfalls tied to a guard's quota. Each shortfall is a missing crust, a stolen portion that adds up to pounds taken from the hands of men who will not survive another month without full bread. The narrator follows the ledger to a name, a code the guards use. The kitchen foreman says the code is for the guard on duty. He hesitates, then points to Sergeant Moroz without naming him. The yard stills. Moroz's face does not change, but he flicks his gaze to the foreman with interest. The narrator records the point. He writes the guard code and the amount missing in the margin. In the infirmary corner, a thin woman hums a prayer under breath. Her name is Lyudmila. She moves like a wounded animal toward old Pavel and presses a piece of cloth to her chest. Pavel closes his eyes. The narrator watches them, because the ledger has given a new shape to their suffering. It names who takes. Lyudmila speaks in a voice without shock. "I've been hiding crumbs," she says. Her fingers find a seam of her coat and draw out a brittle piece of bread wrapped in cloth. She hands it to old Pavel. Pavel fingers the cloth. He smells leather and smoke on her hands. He says, "Lyudmila, you risk everything." Lyudmila finishes. Her jaw tightens. She looks at the narrator. "Write this. Put it with the ledger." The narrator writes the confession. He writes the name and the time and the way Lyudmila's hands shook as she pulled crumbs from a pocket. He writes because evidence must be visible on paper. It must live outside murmurs and accusations. The crowd watches her reveal as though this small admission might tip scales. Later, at the barrack entrance, a guard inspects pockets. He presses fingers into the seams and produces a crust from old Pavel's coat. The guard holds it up. "Hoards," he says with a cold satisfaction. The crowd circles. The narrator says, "Inspect the ledger. This crust has to match a missing tolly." Moros answers, "We will follow procedure." He means he will do what keeps authority unchallenged. Pavel is forced into the inspection line. He moves with a slowness born of age and habit. Guards shout commands. The narrator notes the public shaming. Hands fumbling, other prisoners forced to pat down their own sleeves to expose empty palms. This is punishment performed as theater. It signals that any attempt to keep food will be found and punished. The narrator slips out into the narrow guard corridor that runs behind the kitchen. Frost eats at the edges of the floorboards. A lamp hangs on a chain and wavers with a faint draft. The corridor smells of oil and boiled potatoes. A small makeshift office contains a wooden crate used as a desk. On it, beneath a slate of tin, the narrator finds a falsified ledger entry. The handwriting does not match the foreman's neat scrawl. The numbers are written in a guard's hurried strokes. The entry connects a guard's quota to a private line item. He lifts the page. The ink smears where someone clutched the paper with a sweaty hand. The name code reappears. The narrator's suspicion hardens into accusation at this point. He copies the page into his notebook and slides it back so no one sees his theft. The second shift occurs here. Anger toward the foreman dissolves into a colder certainty that the system itself funnels food away. Suspicion becomes proof. He returns to the barrack and sits where he can watch distribution. The kitchen hatch slams shut with a sound like a lid. Men argue about portions as if the argument might force the ration to grow. The narrator listens to the voices because voices reveal alliances. The kitchen foreman tells one guard, "You took the 10 yesterday." "I logged it." The guard replies, "You logged it as spoilt." They trade short phrases, each guarding an explanation. Down the plank, Ivan attempts a smuggle. He folds bread into his sleeve and reaches for another prisoner's hand to pass the crust. A woman near them, seeing the motion, tugs Ivan's sleeve. The narrator sees the movement, a small plan enacted in two bent wrists. Lyudmila watches with her mouth dry. Her fingers press into the cloth of her dress. A guard's shadow falls across Ivan. Sergeant Moros steps into the center of the plank as if on a stage. He snatches the sleeve with a quick twist. "You think you can steal?" he asks. Ivan has no words, his jaw works. Lyudmila says, "Ivan, take it back." Old Pavel pushes forward to intervene. There are 3 lines of rapid exchange then, voices short and sharp. "Pavel, stay. You will not beat him. Back. Don't touch him. Hands behind your back." Moros laughs once. He lifts his baton and strikes Pavel across the ribs. The sound is dry and hard. Pavel bends and catches himself on his knees. The narrator records each impact. The snap of flesh, the wet sound when clothing tears at a seam, the way a rib may push where bone meets skin. Men fall silent because silence means survival for those who remain. Moros drags Pavel into the snow. He strips him to his waist with a cuff that reveals a quick red seam across the skin. A prisoner tries to clamp a blanket around him and a guard shoves the blanket away. Pavel's teeth clack. His breath comes as steam. The narrator stands with his notebook and watches the world narrow to sound and motion. Boots, grunts, the smack of a palm. As Moros beats him, the crowd shifts. People move closer and then farther, distance traded for risk. Lyudmila screams a single line. Stop! It is a human sound, not an argument. Men rush forward to intervene. Moros calls in two other guards. The prisoners are pushed backward with fists and rifle butts. Pavel's shirt rides up. Blood glistens at his side. The narrator notes every detail, because recording these harms matters. Who hit? How many blows? Where the blood fell? Pavel is forced outside the yard into the blizzard. He is half naked and shoves forward with the guards prodding him like a beast. The narrator follows at a distance and writes as breath fogs the page. The climax is a public lesson. Obedience made brutal. The cold compounds the beating's purpose. Men watch this lesson and count what acceptance will cost them. That night, the narrator returns to the barrack and finds Pavel collapsed beside a single candle. The candle burns low, and the room smells of sweat and iron. Lyudmila sits on a crate near him. Her hands are raw from holding together thin fabrics. She tucks a small prayer bead into his palm, fingers trembling as if the bead might shatter under the small pressure of giving. Pavel's eyes open long enough to catch the bead and then close. He arranges his hands over the bead as if to keep it warm. The narrator records the action with a line. Pavel held the bead and did not speak. That silence holds more than words can. It is a decision not to accuse openly for fear of reprisal, and yet the bead is a defiance small enough to hide. The narrator pins the ledger evidence into the seam under his mattress. He wraps the copied page in oilcloth and presses it flat. He thinks about how proof can travel. Hidden pages, whispered names, a bead passed between fingers. Each small object carries a claim against power. He has a choice. Expose the falsified entries now and risk immediate reprisals, or circulate the ledger slowly among trusted hands so it might seed doubt without being traced back to a single person. He chooses the slower path. He moves among the prisoners and drops a line to Ivan, to Lyudmila, and to one of the kitchen boys who owes him a favor. Keep the ledger safe, he says. Do not speak of it to more than 3. They respond with nods and short sentences. Ivan stammers. If Moros finds, he does not finish. The narrator notes the last twist. The kitchen foreman cries in the dark, not from guilt but from terror of being turned into the scapegoat. He paces and talks to himself, naming days and sacks and accounts, and the narrator writes these named details down. The foreman clutches at the ledger the way Pavel clutches the bead. Both are holding fragile things. Where before suspicion had fallen on the foreman alone, the falsified entry shows a collusion. Guard quotas siphoning food through a system of coded entries. There must be consequences. That night, a junior guard is awakened and given strict orders. Deny any tampering, claim clerical error. The narrator overhears the exchange because he moves quietly through the barrack with the ledger under his coat. He records the guard's words in shorthand and leaves a duplicate copy with Lyudmila. By dawn, morale has shifted. Men do not trust quick answers. Conversations begin with names. Moros log the 10, one says. The foreman wrote spoilt, another replies. Questions spread into the queue like a small leak under a door. That leak is a shift, certainty into organized resistance. The narrator sees it take shape in measured looks, in the way Ivan holds his sleeve differently, in how Lyudmila moves a little straighter. The narrator avoids grand proclamations. He writes concrete instructions for the next step. Document every distribution, mark packet weights, press witnesses to own their observations. He assigns tasks to the prisoners who are less likely to be noticed. One to watch the hatch, one to count plates, one to measure bread. The plan is quiet and precise. It is not heroic speech, but a set of small, repeated actions intended to expose the system. An external event shifts the rhythm again. A guard slips and knocks over a stack of plates in the mess. The crash brings everyone running. The narrator uses the moment to pass a folded note to the kitchen boy. The boy tucks it into his apron and moves to the hatch. The note instructs him to mark a sack as whole rather than declared spoilt. This small deception will create a paper trail that contradicts the official ledger. The night after, someone finds that one of the guard quota entries has shifted. The number that was logged as spoilt now reads full. The foreman does not notice quickly enough to claim error. The narrator sees a fissure widening. The ledger can be used against itself. Men whisper that the ledger belongs to everyone who reads it now. Old alliances break and reform around who can be trusted. But the cost remains. Pavel lies feverish. His breath thuds against a patched blanket. Lyudmila stays near him, pressing a cloth to the wound where Moros struck. She says, "He kept a peace for Ivan." The narrator notes how choices spread. Pavel stepped forward to protect a boy. That choice placed him in the public line, and it broke his bones. That brokenness matters. The narrator writes every medical sign he sees, because bones left to frost will not knit well. He describes the bandages, the fever, the way Pavel's lips dry and split. These are not metaphors. They are records of threat and consequence. They change the ledger from a piece of paper into a document of blame and a map of crimes. At the end of the night, the narrator stands at the hatch and looks into the kitchen. The kitchen foreman sits with his head in his hands. Moros walks past him without looking. The narrator decides to leave a single copy of the falsified entry folded in the foreman's pocket, where only he will find it. The act is precise, not public shaming, but a seed of doubt. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. A guard knocks on the barrack door. Someone answers. The knock is 3 sharp taps. It is a demand, and it will shape the morning. The narrator pockets his pencil, tucks the ledger under his mattress, and watches Lyudmila move to place a blanket over Pavel. The bead is still in his hand. The knock comes again, harder. The night gives way without grand declarations. The ledger exists in 2 hands now, one that protects, one that fears. The narrator thinks of his role as witness, and of the ledger as a small weapon. He has shifted the fear in the yard into a planned resistance, slow and deliberate. Outside, the snow hisses against the eaves as the sergeant waits for a report. Inside, a man breathes shallow and a bead warms under a palm. The knock at the door concludes the chapter with an action that demands an answer. A concrete event that will carry into the next morning. Emotion root. Fear appears in the first sentences and drives choices throughout. Fear pushes the narrator into action, forces Lyudmila to hide crumbs, drives Ivan to smuggle, and makes Pavel step forward. 2 clear emotion shifts occur. Suspicion hardens into anger when the ledger shows discrepancies. That anger cools into strategic resolve when falsified entries are found. Later, anger and fear coalesce into a quiet defiance that spreads as small plans and hidden notes. These shifts show themselves in movement, dialogue, and precise choices, not in abstract statements. Names to remember from this chapter. Old Pavel, who takes a beating for another. Lyudmila, who hides crumbs and tends wounds. Sergeant Moros, who enforces obedience. The kitchen foreman, who keeps the book. Ivan, the young prisoner who risks a smuggle. And the narrator, who records, copies, and distributes proof. Each advances the plot by action. Pavel by protection, Lyudmila by confession and care, Moros by violence, the foreman by his ledger entries, Ivan by taking risk. And the narrator by choosing how to spread the evidence. The ledger now travels hidden in a mattress seam. The evidence exists in 2 pockets. A copied page under oilcloth, and a planted falsified entry in a foreman's apron. The prisoners have a plan that is not a speech but a set of small acts. Watch, count, mark, and report to trusted hands. The beaten man breathes shallow, and the bead lies beneath his fingers. The knock at the door ends the night and forces the next decision. This chapter resolves its immediate conflict. The public accusation, the discovery of falsified entries, and the beating are all witnessed and recorded, and a method of slow exposure is set. It closes not with a moral flourish, but with a demand at the door, a precise, outward event that requires a choice and will carry consequences into the next chapter. A thin man stumbled and collapsed beneath the timber. The load tipped, and the rough edge of a beam gouged snow from the yard. The narrator dropped his pen and closed his notebook a fraction of an inch, then crouched to record the exact time and the man's number. Emotion route. Betrayal. He wrote the guard's name and the quota posted that morning, and the word betrayal followed every line like a notation of cause and consequence. The narrator watched the men in the logging line shift their weight and keep moving. They had no room to stop for a fallen body. Dawn light cut low across the ice. The immediate problem was concrete. An impossible daily quota, starving hands that could not lift the promised weight, and a foreman with a folded list that decided who lived through the week. The narrator's first actions were methodical. He touched the man's sleeve to check for a number and noted a shallow bruise forming under the collarbone where a guard's boot had caught him earlier in the yard. Prisoner Michael made a small, animal sound when a guard hauled him by the cuff. "Michael, up, guard Ivan." And his voice had the practiced flatness of someone who chose cruelty for ease. Michael tried to push himself under the load and failed. The beam scraped across his back, and his breath came in short, visible bursts. The narrator scribbled the time again and underlined the quota figure posted on the log house wall. 30, 2 for the line. 30, 2 men were supposed to pass that hauling point in an hour. The narrator could measure hunger in the way prisoners moved, seeking leverage on a frozen rope, fingers working less and faster than muscle would allow. Beyond the immediate fact of the collapse, the narrator felt the logic of betrayal pressing his hands to the notebook. Betrayal shaped his choices. He moved closer to the line to watch who counted bodies and who counted output. He followed guard Ivan's eyes as Ivan scanned faces for fatigue more than for names. The narrator's first decision was to mark names. He wrote Michael and the time and the number of steps the guards forced the line to take before another man could pause. That ledger entry was a tiny act against the camp ledger that would later hide the truth. Someone in the line hissed, "He can move." Prisoner Enya it loud enough that the guards heard Enya. Guard Ivan snapped, and he jabbed a gloved finger at her shoulder. Enya, thin and wrapped in a threadbare coat, stepped forward and then back. She had been at the post that morning, carrying a small scrap of bread she hid in the hem. The narrator had seen her fingers work the cloth earlier and had memorized the way she kept her chin tucked against the wind. The foreman unfolded the folded list and read names in a voice that sounded like it was trying to be fair. Kovalenko, he read, Michael. He flicked his fingers to the right, the signal to the nearest guards. 2 men were cuffed and stepped out of line. Ivan's boot landed hard on a shoulder to make the movement quick. The narrator wrote those details with no comment. The immediate conflict was clear. Survival depended on arbitrary numbers rather than on who could work. Inside the guard office, the narrator found the camp doctor poring over papers. The doctor kept his sleeves rolled and his hands cold. The narrator pushed a ledger toward the doctor and tapped a column labeled Escape, where a recent death had been marked. The doctor looked at the ledger and his face changed in a way the narrator measured in small details. The doctor swallowed, his fingers rubbed a spot of lint on the table, and then he admitted, they reordered from above. The admission was short, practical, and it revealed the scale of concealment, ordered from above. The narrator, they tell us to mark these as escapes when they die on the line, when they done return from the guard hut, the doctor said. He the words with the same flat cadence he used when listing supplies. The narrator recorded the confession. The ledger discrepancy was a second, more systematic betrayal. The camp did not merely punish, it rewrote consequence into absence. The narrator left the office with a photocopied sheet slipped into his pocket an expense of risk he noted by pressing his thumb over the corner, and he moved back to the yard. He watched Michael again and saw how the man held himself to make fewer demands on the line. He noted how the men who missed quota tried other strategies. Hiding a crust, trading a sleeve, moving slower to avoid being singled out. The narrator's attention to these details was his method of resistance. He would keep a record where the camp erased names. When a man on the line reached for a dropped tool, 2 guards closed in and shoved him to the ice. The sound was a hard slap against frozen ground. Prisoners stepped aside automatically because stepping in brought the same shove. The narrator wrote the shove into his notebook, and then went into the barrack to see who had the crusts that morning. In the dim barrack, figures huddled on wooden planks beneath a single ragged blanket. The narrator noticed the pattern of knuckles, some still red from frost, some swollen from beating. He moved along the row and found Enya sitting with her back against a plank, holding a scrap of torn paper between 2 fingers. She did not look up when he sat beside her. The scrap was a schedule, a list of names and times, written in a cramped script. Where did you get that? The narrator. Enya shook her head. It was in a sleeve, she said. Her voice was low and precise. Someone slipped it from a guard's coat. I hid it. Her hands trembled when she smoothed the paper. The narrator read the timetable, Hutt's dates, and a tiny note that read Isolation 2200. He folded the scrap into his notebook. Every new fact sharpened his sense of betrayal. The punishments were not random petty cruelties. They were scheduled, organized, and recorded. The narrator added the schedule to his notes and marked a page number. He decided to confront someone who could explain intent. The camp doctor. The doctor's earlier admission had been brief. The narrator needed names attached to orders. At mid-morning, the narrator returned to the doctor's room. He found the doctor ticking off items on a low stove and moving as if running through a checklist. You wrote escapes as deaths. The narrator. The doctor sighed and stopped his motion. We change numbers so the center sees fewer fatalities, he said. They will replace the men. They prefer the work to the explanation. His eyes avoided the narrator as, I sign where I am told. I count where I am told. It keeps me alive. The narrator noted the doctor's list of excuses as evidence of system-level choice, not mere survival mechanics. Outside at midday, a prisoner tried to trade a scrap of bread for a few hours' rest. He stepped toward the line with his hand extended and an offered crust. Guard Ivan grabbed the scrap between 2 fingers and flicked it out like a small animal. No barter, Ivan. He pushed the man to the ground and struck him once with the butt of his rifle. The man rolled and cuffed. The narrator wrote the strike and the man's name in full. He recorded the precise sound of the rifle butt hitting a sternum, the way breath rushed out in white plumes. A crowd of men watched and moved closer only to step back when Ivan's eyes swept them. The beating served as a public lesson. The narrator documented it without comment, but with every detail that would later contradict the false ledger. That afternoon the narrator found a quiet spot near the supply shed. He watched guard Sergei move wood into a heap and then pause. Sergei's shoulders were tight. His hands worked slower than the other guards. The narrator had seen Sergei before. A man who kept his head down but whose gaze lingered on the prisoners with something like regret. The narrator went to him. Sergei, he said, you give me a name. Which Hutt's tonight? Sergei looked around the yard, then stepped under the low eaves of the shed and closed the door behind him. He fumbled in his pocket and handed the narrator a folded report. Hutt 7 and Hutt 3 tonight, he said in a voice with small breaks. They want to empty them for the sweep. He pushed the paper into the narrator's hand as if passing contraband. The narrator felt a shift, an internal action, where the camp showed a crack in its own machine. Why risk it? The narrator. Sergei's jaw tightened, because we keep the ledger for them, and I cannot mark escape when I know it's a sealed hut, he said. Because I have a sister at home. Because I remember a face I used to know. The words were simple. The narrator recorded them. This was not a confession. It was an offered fact that changed how the narrator could act. When night fell, the guards read names again and escorted the selected men toward the punishment hut. The narrator followed at a measured distance. The chosen men shuffled under the moonlight, breath sharp and visible. Michael walked in the group without protest. He had no strength for argument. Aeneas' face went pale and then set into a tense line. The narrator kept his notebook open against his chest and counted breaths like a metronome for the line. At the door of the punishment hut, guards shoved the men inside and hammered the bar into place. The lock closed with a mechanical certainty. Guard Ivan pushed the bar and turned. His shoulders did not tremble. When the narrator caught Sergei's eye, Sergei gave a small nod and then stepped back into shadow. The narrator understood that nod as an agreement and a warning. Hours later, a search team came to the hut to check for escapes. They forced the door and stepped into the shallow room. One man lay against the wall, chest still, frost gathered in his hair. The others moaned and pressed themselves against the boards. The narrator watched the expression on guard Ivan's face as he took in the body and then turned away to make a report. The narrator wrote that he saw Ivan stand very still, then open his mouth to speak and close it. He recorded the exact words Sergei used when he said, "We were ordered to leave them sealed." That line was an explanatory fact that absolved a lot on paper. The narrator copied the scene into his notebook with the minuteness of a clerk copying an inventory. After the hut door was pried, the doctor arrived with a list and a rubber stamp. He moved through the bodies, pronouncing time of death with an economy that made the narrator's blood run cold. The camp would change those lines to escape in the ledger and send them away in the morning report. Betrayal had reached its formal instrument. Paper. The narrator photographed the stamped time with a small camera he kept hidden in his coat, and then tore the picture from the roll and slid it behind his notebook page. Back in the barrack late that night, the prisoners counted heads and compared them to the list on the wall. The narrator copied names into his own ledger. Enia traced a name with a finger and then pushed the finger forward so others could see the mark. "They took Alexei," she said. The room went quiet. Mikhail put his hand on Enia's shoulder and squeezed. The narrator wrote both names and the time. He listened as men planned a small sabotage. Muddle quotas, hide planks, loosen tools, make the next day's tally unreliable. A sudden noise outside made everyone snap to attention. A dog barked once and then fell silent. The narrator felt the hairs on his neck tighten. He closed the notebook slowly and asked, "Who can move tomorrow during the line?" The men answered in low voices. Each answer changed the list of who would stand in the cold. This conversation was a compact of survival strategy. It was action and not reflection. The narrator made a decision then. He would not only record, he would act to obscure quotas. He and Michael agreed on 2 changes for the next day. Misplace a single log at the hauling point and shift numbers on a single ledger page in the guardroom during the midday shift change. Sergei, when the narrator him, only nodded once. The guard's nod was a pledge with no words. It was fragile, but it existed. It altered the power balance in a small, concrete way. Across the next morning the plan partly succeeded. A misplaced log jammed the line and cost the foreman time. Men stepped over one another, forced to slow, and the posted quota looked unattainable. In the guard office a ledger page was wet with spilled tea and smeared, and when the doctor reached for a pen he found a single number changed. The narrator saw the foreman's face flush and heard him curse. That small failure of procedure bought several men extra minutes at the work point. It did not stop the mechanism, but it opened a space for breath. Then a new fact arrived, a report that the center wanted a clean tolly that afternoon. The guards read the demand and tightened the day's schedule. The narrator realized the risk they had taken. The small sabotage now tasted like a provocation. He paged back through his notebook and counted the recorded names, the falls, the beatings, the altered ledger lines. Each entry had shifted his fear into a controlled, practical urgency. In the afternoon, the foreman announced an inspection and began to read names from a shorter list. Men were singled out faster than before. The narrator felt the tension climb as they moved toward evening. He kept close to Enya and Mikhail. Both repeated the plan in short phrases so each understood. When they bar the door, count the locks, Mikhail. When Sergei gives the look, move. The directions were small and tactical. They were the only kind the camp permitted without immediate reprisal. Night came with wind that made the door of the punishment hut bang like a slow drum. The guards marched the selected prisoners in. Mikhail's shoulders were set. Enya's jaw worked as she walked. The narrator kept his notebook open and wrote the time the bar was hammered home. He watched the guard's hands on the bar and memorized the pattern of nails. He watched Ivan's face, which did not change when the door closed. When they pried the door a few hours later, finding one man already dead, the narrator felt a sharp, private sickening that he documented precisely. The man's breath stopped in a way that left a small white puff of expelled air frozen in the corner. The body's fingers were clawed. A smear of blood had dried along the temple. He noted who had pushed the report to be filed and who had stood by. The narrator saw Sergei blink and then walk away. He recorded a single phrase from the camp doctor. Marked as escape, it was an administrative verdict that erased a life. Afterward, the surviving men gathered under the thin candle in the barrack. The narrator copied names into his notebook and counted the difference between the camp's role and his own. Enya took a scrap of thread and tied a knot in the corner of her sleeve to remember those taken. Mikhail pushed his palm flat against the wooden board, as if holding the list there. The men exchanged a plan to obscure quotas in the future and to smear the foreman's tally. The narrator wrote their plan and circled it twice. Before sleep, the narrator closed his notebook and placed the folded photograph of the stamped time behind the last page. He felt the ledger's weight in his coat like a small, cold stone. The chapter's immediate conflict, the scheduled punishment, and the camp's choice to convert death into escape, was resolved in the sense that the narrator had proof and the men had a plan. The narrator had acted on betrayal rather than merely recording it. A soft sound at the door interrupted the quiet. Someone tapping, 3 slow knocks. The narrator rose, moved to the plank, and peered into the dim corridor. A figure slipped inside and dropped another folded paper onto the table. It was another schedule, with an extra name added in a different hand. Sergei's nod earlier now read as a warning and as a plea. The narrator took the paper, slid it into his notebook, and with a steady hand wrote the hour and the names to remember. The last line he wrote before sleep was not a reflection but a concrete action. He ranked the names he would try to keep from disappearing from the official lists. He closed the notebook and pushed it beneath his coat, where his pocket watch and the small camera lay. The night outside held wind and the dull, continuous creak of the barrack. The narrator listened to the breathing of the men and then, finally, wrote down the single change they would try next. Make the next tally unreliable enough to force a recount. That decision landed as a practical step, not a vow. The chapter ends with a concrete sound. A knock at the outer gate some time after midnight, a muffled voice calling an order, and 3 boots walking away. The narrator put his hand on the notebook and felt the cold press through fabric. He counted breaths in the dark, and for the second time that night he folded the schedule into his palm, sealing the page with the knowledge that names could be hidden on paper, but not from a man who wrote every detail down. A guard yanked a thin man from the work queue by the collar and dragged him across packed snow while the line froze in place. Betrayal sat under the narrator's ribs, not a private ache, but a ledgered wound he felt as obligation. He opened his notebook and recorded the time. The chosen man's coat tore at the shoulder, fabric rasping like dry paper. Men watched with the same slow breath they used when a sentry counted rations. Someone had already been told to watch, and the yard had been reshaped into theater. He noted the number on the prisoner's chest as the guard kicked the man's boot. The narrator's hand moved with deliberate slowness. He wrote the guard's name, then the prisoner's. He had seen this before, the boot that slammed into the snow in the first yard roll call. The same sound that echoed in his memory from the day a man's coat snagged and slid across ice. That memory from the frozen yard still fit across his notebook margins. A boot, a torn shoulder, the smell of breath and thawing snow. Now, the pattern repeated with minor variations. He marked it with the same sentence structure and a small vertical line to show repetition. Petrov, someone said low. The narrator looked up. Sergeant Petrov held the man by the collar, his face flat and unreadable beneath the brim. Petrov's movements were economical. He released the prisoner's arm as if minimizing contact and left the man to straighten his jacket that no longer fit over raw shoulder. Misha moved forward before anyone else could, stepping between the line and the yard's perimeter. "Stop, Misha, he's had enough. Move back," Petrov answered. He pushed Misha with the flat of his hand. Misha stumbled and gripped the wooden rail of the barrack doorway. The narrator watched Misha's fingers curl white around worn wood. There was the instant change he had been waiting to record, solidarity becoming risk. He wrote Misha's name and the way his knuckles trembled. Ivan Kuznetsov did not look away. He let his chin fall, then raised it and spoke into the drift of men. "Ivan," Misha called, "what did you take?" Ivan did not answer with words. He pressed his mouth into a thin line. That silence became its own statement. The narrator recorded the silence as proof, a refusal not to deny guilt, but to preserve what dignity remained. Captain Orlov came out of the guard post carrying a folded sheet of paper. He read the order aloud with measured cadence. The selected man would receive disciplinary exposure for alleged hoarding. The sentence landed on the yard like a metal report. The narrator recorded the phrasing exactly and the captain's clipped tone, then noted how the men shifted so their shoulders aligned like a low, wattage fence. Petrov and a second guard marshaled the prisoner between them. They walked him past the barracks, past the row of faces pressed to slatted windows. The narrator followed at 2 paces behind, notebook closed for the first time since dawn. His voice was not a voice in this moment. It was a pen scratching down the sequence of events. He counted steps and wrote the numbers in the margin. Every step felt ceremonial, as if the camp was reasserting an order larger than hunger, the spectacle of correction. They reached the narrow path toward the isolation block. Snow packed into the prisoner's boots, making a wet scrape with each foot. A man tripped on a hidden frost lip and righted himself by pressing his palm to the barrack's siding. An external event, the stumble made several heads turn and lengthened the procession's shadows. The narrator paused, recorded the stumble as an ordinary hazard that would become evidence later if the prisoner failed to return. He had learned to treat accidents the way clerks treated receipts. Anomalies to be catalogued. Inside the isolation cell, the guards stripped the prisoner to rags. A guard spoke in a voice meant for hearing and for show. "You will wait outside tonight," he said. "You will learn the price." The narrator wrote that sentence as if it were a diagnosis. He recorded the exact phrasing "outside tonight" and the guard's slow inflection on the last word. The prisoner's hands clenched around imaginary warmth. The narrator watched the fingers flex, the knuckles rise white under thin skin. Betrayal, that root feeling, guided his hand. He noted how the camp converted accusation into ritual. The narrator approached Petrov quietly later, under the paled light of afternoon. "Why exposure?" he asked, pen poised. Petrov fixed him with a look. "We need examples, Petrov." His voice had the economy of someone naming tools. "Hoarding breaks the line." The narrator repeated the sentence on the page, then raised his eyes. "And the man gets left out." Petrov shrugged. "He learns to stop." A second emotion arrived then. Doubt shifted into a pocket of cold clarity. The narrator felt the change in his throat, hesitation folding into the precise observation that Petrov's explanation was theta, not necessity. He wrote theta and circled it. In his mind, the earlier ledger of the barrack had shown similar performances. A crust on the floor, a man shoved so a loaf could pass. The narrator connected the ledger entries. He found patterns that read like policy. At dusk, Misha slipped from the barrack with something small wrapped in cloth. He moved low and quick between sleeping men, the narrator counting him as he passed. Misha's shoulders hunched. He kept his head down. The narrator felt a quick pivot from clinical distance to something else, protective urge. He had seen Misha earlier when Ivan's crust rolled under a thawed plank. Misha had been the one to step forward then as well. That memory was concrete. Hands reaching for a crust, the crust skidding under a board. Now Misha moved again with the same impulse. Misha reached the fence and hurled the wrapped object toward the isolation cell. It asked in the muted light and struck snow near the cell door. He moved to pocket a scrap of cloth and slip away. Petrov saw him. Caught, Petrov snapped. He crossed the yard like a blade. Misha tried to say something. Hands up! Petrov barked. 2 guards seized Misha and dragged him into the open. They laid him on snow and began a beating that carved a steady pattern into the night. Fist, palm, boot. Fist, palm, boot. The narrator recorded each strike in short, factual lines. He wrote the sequence as though it were measurement. He wrote Misha's name and the sound of his breath breaking. This was the chapter's peak. The moment when hope collided with camp order and the cost unfolded loud and public. The beating lasted until Misha stopped moving. He lay face down with his mouth open in a vowel that no one finished. Men at the barrack entrances pulled collars higher and leaned away. The narrator noticed a shift in the yard's temperature that had nothing to do with air. Faces hardened, hands retreated, people calculated risk like ration portions. That was an emotion shift from solidarity to fear. It showed in tightening throats and rearranged stances. Why, Ivan standing at the doorway, his voice was strained, the vowels short. Why did you do it, Misha? Misha did not answer. Blood spread across his temple and mixed with snow. The narrator crouched and recorded the bruise pattern for the ledger. He wrote down the exact color and the width of each contusion. He watched other prisoners tilt their heads to avoid watching, a concrete action that supplied the emotional data he needed. Captain Orlov stepped forward then, his shadow long and folded. This is discipline, he told the men. Let the law take hold. An older prisoner spat at Orlov's boots. Law, he said. You call this law? The older man's name was Yakov. The narrator had recorded Yakov's cuff in a previous ledger entry. Yakov had been on the timber detail the day a beam gouged snow from the yard. The narrator referenced that exact event in his head. The timber slip, the man collapsing, the narrator closing his pen a fraction of an inch. He mentioned Yakov aloud to a clerk later, and the clerk remembered the number. A small twist unsettled the sequence. One of the guards, a young man with a thin mustache, hesitated mid-beating and then lowered his hand. He looked at Misha as if he recognized the face. The narrator noted the guard's faltering, the guard's eyes briefly meeting Ivan's. That hesitation changed the target of anger for a second. It made the yard a place where someone could see another person's face and remember shared kitchens or a tobacco tin. It was a surprise that reoriented how the narrator read motives. He put a question mark in the margin next to the guard's name and circled it. When the beating ended, Misha was pulled inside and shoved onto a bunk. The men watched him drag himself into the dark and wrench a blanket over his shoulders. The narrator recorded the blanket as evidence of an after-action, a small attempt at warmth that would be measured against the night outside. He noted the way Misha's breath came shallow and fast. Petrov returned to the isolation cell and found Ivan chained at the outer gate. The prisoner had been dressed again in tatters and was led toward the outer fence. The narrator followed, keeping distance to avoid interference, but close enough to mark every gesture. A guard snapped the chain and fastened it to an iron ring embedded in the frozen ground. The prisoner tried to sit, but his legs would not hold his weight. He swore softly in an index of pain. "Hold him, Petrov," to a second guard. "Why?" the second guard asked, voice low. "So he remembers," Petrov replied. Ivan's teeth chattered. Fingers went white. He spat a wad of blood. The narrator recorded the spittle's color and the small way it froze at the lip. The action grounded the emotional stakes. Physical failure, not abstract despair. The narrator also noticed a tiny, hidden kindness, a prayer bead slipping from a hidden pocket and tumbling into the snow near the prisoner's boot. He had seen that bead earlier in the barrack that night, passed under boards between trembling hands. He wrote the bead down as a discrete object and the path it had taken. The narrator approached Petrov again in the guard post interior later that night. For official details. Petrov offered a thin, hostile explanation, clipped and full of defensive phrases. Orders Petrov, records. Records for whom? The narrator asked. For the camp. Petrov. For stability. Petrov's evasions made the narrator pause. He felt the subtle change from professional detachment to an implied accusation. The narrator's pen hesitated, a micro-action that revealed emotion. He wrote Petrov's words down, then added, "Evasive." He kept writing until his notebook filled a page. Back in the barrack that night, the prisoners did what they always did under pressure. They attempted private, furtive kindness. A crust was folded and passed between palms. A prayer bead was slipped along a slat. Ivan's friend, who had not spoken much earlier, placed his hand on Ivan's shoulder and left it there for a counted breath. They did not talk about the beating. They used small acts to hold to an idea of humanity. The narrator closed his notebook and made that closure itself a recorded event. The transfer of a crust, the pressing of a hand, the tiny offerings that functioned as an underground supply chain of warmth. He entered Misha's space, after lights out. Misha's breath was noisy and ragged. The narrator could hear the wet sound of it, and the rough rasp at the throat. He placed a small folded paper on the bunk next to Misha's hand. It contained Misha's name written clearly, the date, and the recorded time of the beating. He did not write an editorial. He left the paper as a ledger and a witness. A night bell clanged in the distance. That external events slid across the chapter like a hinge. It called the guards to sweep, to record, to reassert boundaries. The narrator stood in the doorway and watched the men pull their collars and adjust their sleep. He counted the guards on patrol and checked his notes for irregularities. He had catalogued thefts and timber accidents and bread crust incidents in earlier entries. He now placed this beating within the same taxonomy. He had one more task before he would close the ledger for the night. He walked to the barrack door and called Ivan by name. Ivan came out slowly. The narrator asked one question he already knew the answer to. Will he survive the night? Ivan looked up. He mouthed something small. Maybe, he said, voice raw. The narrator wrote maybe and circled it. He could have pressed for more, for admission or confession, but his method was to record actions and to let them speak. He recorded Misha's breathing, Ivan's chained stance, Petrov's clipped replies. He recorded Yakov's spit at Orlov and the guard's brief falter mid-beating. Before leaving the yard, he recorded one final, concrete detail. The iron gate at the outer fence swung once, and then closed with a metallic clank that reverberated through the snow. The sound was definitive and simple. It settled the chapter's ledger. The narrator closed his notebook and slid it into his inner coat pocket. He walked back to the barrack, counted the bunks with his eyes, and added the final line to the day's entry. The name of the exposed prisoner, the names of those who acted, the exact times, and the single note. Exposure enforced. Public beating enacted. Small kindnesses preserved. He did not write analysis. He wrote actions. He left the yard with the registry of pain in his pocket, and the knowledge that the camp's mechanisms had been reaffirmed. Outside, the iron gate clanged shut again, and the chains on Ivan's ankle drew a thin scrape through the snow as the prisoner was dragged past the posts. That scrape was the chapter's last concrete sound. A sergeant read a name, and the man named Ivan moved out of the line, his boots scraping ice as if the ground wanted to hold him back. Betrayal tightened the narrator's jaw. He watched the man meet the sergeant's eyes and slow his step, as if the roster itself had accused him. A thin sound came from the crowd when the name landed, low and metallic, and the narrator made the time on his page with a clipped pen stroke. Within 5 breaths the moment was already a verdict available in ink. Reassignment. The immediate problem presented itself plainly. Those called to leave did not return. He had learned to treat the ledger like an instrument. The narrator moved through the parade ground with a measured gait, wool collar up, the pocket watch closed against his palm. He did not speak unless obliged. His job was to observe and record. Betrayal sat under his ribs like a ledger item he could not erase. Every earlier entry told of demand and cruelty. He remembered a man who had dropped a crust at the hatch, the crust skidding beneath a thawed plank as others shoved past. An image from the barrack ledger that had lodged behind his eyes. He remembered the timber that Gog's snow at work detail, and the guard's name he had written in the margin. He remembered the thin man dragged by the collar. Those notations had begun as facts. Now they read like a map. The parade ground smelled of iron and wet wool. Guard Captain Sergei stood with his back straight, breath visible in the cold. He held the roster in both hands and read with a voice that kept the syllables flat. The narrator kept his notebook open and kept the guard's name at the top of the page. When Sergei reached Ivan's name, he did not look at the man. The narrator wrote the number, the time, the column checked for transfer. He glanced at Clerk Petrov, who lingered at the registry table, fingers stained with ink and something darker. Ivan Petrovich, Sergei, prepare. Ivan stepped forward, white in the face, and then his legs failed. He stumbled on the ice and a man behind him reached. But the guard nearest shoved the bystander back with the toe of his boot. The narrator's hand paused and then moved. Notation, collapse, shove. The event forced a choice into the open, whether to intervene, to note, or to look away. The narrator did none of those dramatic things. He recorded. Betrayal pushed him toward a recorded truth that required action beyond notation. Clerk Petrov folded a scrap and slid it into the narrator's coat when the captain turned to call the next name. The narrator felt the paper cold against his ribs. He did not move his head. He opened the folded edge with one finger and found an extra column inked with a small black symbol beside 3 names. He read the mark twice and then a third time. It was not an administrative mark for transport. The symbol meant silence. Petrov, Sergei without looking back. Report to the registry after the roll. Petrov's shoulders tightened. He walked away without protest, leaving a small smoke of breath behind him. The narrator slid the scrap back into his coat and closed his notebook. Betrayal changed shape into clarity. Suspicion hardened into recognition. He lifted his pen and, in a motion that was both mechanical and deliberate, wrote down the symbol in full beside Ivan's entry. He did not yet know the consequences of that notation, but he knew it altered his duty. At mid-morning the narrator approached Guard Kuznetsov at the registry table and asked, plainly, about the mark. Kuznetsov's face was set like frozen clay. He answered by gripping the ledger and giving a shove meant to make a point. An elder prisoner, Mikhail, toppled from the bench and hit the packed snow, hands clenching at his ribs. The shove turned a ledger question into a public declaration. Paper mattered only because the guards chose to make it matter with force. Why this mark? The narrator asked. Kuznetsov spat in the snow. Ask your captain, he said.
Know your place, recorder Mikhail!
Someone called. Mikhail, are you? Mikhail coughed, reached for his side, and then pulled himself up without a word. The narrator watched his hands shake. He noted the name and the time and the shove, then closed the book for a fraction of a second longer than he should have. The ledger was a list. The ledger had teeth. The captain and Kuznetsov spoke in a low-tensioned argument just off the registry table. The narrator edged close enough to catch the tails of the exchange. Sergei's response was precise and containable. "Names came from beyond the camp," he said. "A sealed directive arrived by courier, sealed by higher authority." Kuznetsov pushed back and called the orders blind obedience. The narrator wrote the word directive in the margin, then copied the exchange with economy, phrases undercut by action. "I do what I'm told, Sergei. We answer when the paper arrives. This isn't for us." Then Kuznetsov shot back. "It is for someone else to carry." The narrator's hand hesitated. The ledger now led him to a new locus of responsibility. If the orders came from elsewhere, the guards could shift blame. If the ledger concealed intent, the ledger itself had become an instrument of murder. He felt a cold resolve press behind his ribs. Resolve that shifted him from passive observer to someone who might have to act on what he recorded. At noon the cart waited in the stony yard like a low, ugly coffin. The narrator stood at the edge of the crowd as men were forced onto the battered wood, one by one. Ivan resisted when a guard seized his arm. He twisted, voice thin and rasping. "Let me go. Ivan, Ivan!" Kuznetsov as he gripped the prisoner. "You go where you are told." "Where are you taking him?" Someone called from the line. "No one asked you," Sergei snapped. A fist hit Ivan's rib cage, and the man folded without a sound. He was lifted and lashed to the cart with a rope that bit into his coat. The narrator wrote every action with the same clinical motion that had recorded smaller cruelties earlier. The crust at the hatch, the timber gouge, the dragged coat. Each notation mapped a pattern. The narrator heard Mikhail mutter something under his breath as he steadied Ivan's head on his knee. Mikhail's hands smelled of boiled turnips and old blood. The narrator looked at Mikhail and then at Ivan and found his own throat tight. Betrayal shifted into anger. The ledger had been used to disguise killing. The cart began to move down the narrow track toward the ravine. Snow groaned under the iron wheels. The narrator walked alongside at a measured distance, notebook open in one hand, and the folded scrap of Petrov's paper in his coat. Volodya, a young man pushed forward earlier for falling behind, moved near the cart, and then lunged at a guard when the driver gave a sharp kick. He struck the boot of the cart driver, and then was struck down with a rifle butt. Snow spat from his mouth. The suddenness of his attack made the captain bark a curt order. "Drive to the ravine?" Sergei snapped. The cart's course changed. The narrator felt the air shift around him, the direction of the wheel, the decision in Sergei's voice. He had recorded transfers that led to other camps. He had recorded punishments that left men with broken ribs. He had not yet recorded orders that converted a transfer into a burial. Now he would. A prisoner lunged again at the guard and was caught by men in uniforms. The narrator wrote the time. He wrote the order. He wrote the name of the driver. The cart slid at the edge of the ravine, a low sound of wood protesting. Hands shoved the cart and it crested the snow lip, and then slid, carrying the figure bound and limp. A shout rose from the crowd and then fell away into the hollow sound of old snow absorbing impact. The narrator stopped writing for precisely one breath. Volodya's face flashed in his mind, the young man's mouth open mid-cry, and then the pen resumed its scratch, as if to prove the event had weight enough to hold. He went after the cart as far as the slope allowed, and then returned to the parade ground. The ledger required completion. He knelt at the registry table as dusk neared and wrote the last entries for the day. Each name took on a different tone now. The small black symbol had turned into a signature of deliberately chosen death. He folded the page with hands that did not tremble outwardly, but that had the tremor of someone containing a new, raw decision. He tucked the folded packet inside his overcoat, where the scrap from Petrov had warmed for a moment under his body heat. A man watched him from the edge of the yard, a fellow prisoner who had peered through the barrack slats earlier when the guard kicked the crust. The man's breath steamed. He did not speak. His eyes held a question. The narrator did not meet them. He stood and buttoned his coat. The packet pressed against his ribs like another name. Inside the barrack that night, men counted with fingers and whispers. Conversations moved around small, practical items: who could spare a piece of bread, who might trade for a spoon. The narrator sat at the end of his narrow berth and wrote in a different hand, copying times and motions, but now he also added context. Who had shoved whom, who had taken a single crust, which guard had laughed. He recorded all because he had to build a record that could carry beyond the camp gates. Mikhail stayed near the registry most of the following morning. The narrator found him repairing the strap of a boot with thread. Mikhail did not ask for help. He spoke once, in a voice cut by fatigue. "Mikhail," the narrator said. "You steadied Ivan." Mikhail looked up. "I had hands," he said. "I kept him from rolling. I kept his head from hitting the ice." "Why did you help?" the narrator asked. Mikhail pressed the thread through the leather with slow, precise motions. "Because someone had to," he said. "Someone always had to." The narrator wrote the exchange. He watched Mikhail's hands move and wrote the fingertip marks in his notebook like evidence. The ledger had begun to shape human responsibility into lines and marks. Mikhail's decision to steady Ivan was a refusal to let the group deny what it saw. The choice shifted distrust into a tiny resistance, and the narrator recorded it as though tallying an answer. Petrov came to the narrator after dawn with a face pushed tight. He stopped a few paces away, hands clenched. The narrator did not need to be asked to open his notebook. He already had the pliant memory of the scrap. Petrov exhaled and then spoke in a lowered voice that still carried fear. "They send names sealed, Petrov. We are told nothing else. Who seals them?" The narrator asked. Petrov swallowed. "A courier from the regional office," he said. "Sealed, signed by a clerk up high. We see the stamp, that is all. Does anyone question the stamp?" the narrator asked. Petrov's eyes slid to the captain as if the man might overhear. "We do not argue with the captain," he said. "We mark, we sign, we write." The narrator wrote Petrov's words. The conversation moved him from suspicion toward a sharper certainty. The camp was an instrument, and the ledger was its mechanism. The fold in his overcoat, the scrap, the sealed packet, they had turned him into a custodian of truth he had once only recorded. He considered options: smuggle the notes, pass them to someone who could leave, burn them, but each choice felt like a small theft against the men whose names weighed the page. Late morning, Kuznetsov found the narrator by the registry and forced a confrontation. He grabbed the narrator's coat corner with his gloved hand. "You write too much, Kuznetsov. You make a joke of what I write," the narrator answered. "You are not a man, Kuznetsov, near shouting now. You are a book. Keep to your pages. Someone has to hold what you do," the narrator said. "Someone has to keep count. You keep count and we keep order, Kuznetsov. That is the law." There were 4 sharp exchanges, rapid and edged. Kuznetsov pushed the ledger toward the narrator's chest, as if to remind him of the physical weight of paper. The narrator felt his breath narrow. He penned the confrontation and left the page open as though to invite scrutiny. The shove and the argument were a public test. Men around them watched. The narrator's choice in that instant was to continue to record or to walk away. He recorded and he stared back. By noon a rumor had moved through the barracks that the driver and the captain had argued about the order to the ravine. Some the captain changed course to hide the deed, others the driver misheard and the cart slid as a simple mistake. The narrator knew the argument at the parade ground. He had written the order. The rumor hardened into a choice for others: believe the captain and accept the ledger's consequences, or believe in an ordered killing that required further action. In the afternoon the narrator met Captain Sergei at the supply shed, where the captain counted rations with an even hand. The captain's eyes were small and cold when he saw the narrator. "Recorder, Sergei. You have a pencil and a ledger." "Keep them out of my way, Captain," the narrator said. "Who authorized the column with the black mark?" Sergei's mouth closed. He folded the ration list like a hinge. A courier had placed a sealed envelope on his desk that morning, he said. The narrator asked whether Sergei had questioned the envelope. Not my business, Sergei, I enforce. You enforce orders that kill men, the narrator said. Sergei's hands tightened on the paper. Orders are orders, he said. You write them. We carry them out. The narrator wrote Sergei's words. He watched the captain's jaw as it worked, and wrote the minute trimmer that passed when Sergei closed his fist. The narrator had reached a point where paper and action were no longer separate roles. He felt a second emotion shift, clarity to dread, where clarity about intent turned to dread at the consequences of exposure. If he exposed the ledger's truth, men would know and the guards would retaliate. If he remained the ledger's keeper, he would live with the weight of names. That evening the narrator folded the page he had sealed earlier into an additional packet, placed it in an inner pocket, and walked to the edge of the fence. The yard lay empty save for frozen footprints and the thin sweep of moonlight. He pressed the packet to his sternum and breathed. Silence around the camp was not comfort. It was a thin film that collected small sounds. He started walking out of the compound, then halted at the gate when a figure crossed his path, Mikhail, hurrying with a splintered spoon wrapped in cloth. Mikhail, the narrator said. You are going out, Mikhail. I have to get this where it will be read, the narrator said. Mikhail hitched the spoon under his arm like a badge. You will not go alone, he said. They moved together to the supply shed and waited until night deepened. The narrator kept his head down when the patrol passed. At the outer lane, he placed the packet into a hollow in the post where drivers sometimes left messages. His hand trembled and then held steady. He thought of the crust that fell at the hatch, the timber that had gouged snow, the man dragged by his collar. He had recorded all of them, and now he sealed this one to carry truth further than his pages had ever reached. He left the post and walked back beneath the fence, jacket buttoned, steps small. Behind the gate a dog barked and then went quiet. He heard a guard order a light snuffed. When he reached the barrack he unbuttoned his coat and felt the folded packet was still there, heavier perhaps, because now it contained decision rather than mere observation. He had changed. Notation had become action in the tight pocket beneath his heart. The morning after, word spread that the region had sent a response. The courier had returned with a note scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. Names would be reviewed. The narrator met Petrov by the registry table and passed a look that held more than simple fact. Petrov nodded once and, without speaking, set his hand on the ledger and turned a page as if to remind them both that paper could reorder fate. Later that day Kuznetsov pushed a new roster across the table. Sergei wanted the recorder to sign as witness to the roll call. The narrator took the pen, hesitated for a single breath, and then put the nib to the paper. He wrote his name as he had always done and then, without looking up, slipped the sealed packet out of his coat and passed it across the table to Petrov when the guard's back was turned. Petrov palmed it under the ledger. The brief action was all the resistance they could afford. Kuznetsov noticed the glance and moved toward them, suspicion narrowing his eyes. He nothing, but the threat in his posture was clear. The narrator kept his face composed. He had recorded shoves, kicks, and orders. He could not be intimidated into silence with one glare. That night a cart rolled away down the ravine road. The narrator watched from a window slit and wrote the time. He recorded the driver's name, the captain's order, the voice that had given the command. He wrote because counting preserved what the guards would prefer to forget. The next morning a letter arrived. The regional office had requested a formal report, and the captain would be required to provide one. Men whispered that the captain he had only carried out instructions. The narrator read the captain's note and added it to his folded packet. Days later, orders came from the office that certain men were to be transferred out and that others would remain. The ledger expanded and contracted at the whim of stamps and envelopes. The narrator kept writing. He added marginal notes. Who steadied whom, who kicked a crust, who had hidden a spoon. The packet grew heavier with paper and consequence. Each notation bound him tighter to the choice he had made, to keep and to distribute truth when possible. He had become a custodian in both senses, one who records and one who protects. At dusk on the last day of that month, the narrator slipped from the registry and walked the lane beneath the wire one more time. He stopped at the hollow in the post and found the packet missing. Panic pricked him, then eased into a hard, measured strain. Petrov had the packet. He had taken it. The narrator met him under the sentry light. Petrov's eyes showed it, a faint, relieved light. You took it, the narrator said. Petrov nodded. I took it, he said. I will send it when the coach passes. Mikhail stepped up then with a hand on the narrator's sleeve. We all saw, he said. We recorded. We will tell if we die. The narrator's lips did not move. He felt the ledger at his side as a cold weight. Men had steadied one another, had refused to let a crust fall to nothing. The narrator had recorded those choices, and then had folded his own choice into paper. The final decision he made that night was quiet. He would continue to write and to pass the packet when a chance came, and he would not be the man who only watched. He would keep count, and he would choose with the ledger in his hand. When morning came, the camp read out a list of transfers. Names were called like menace of men. The narrator stood with his notebook closed in his coat and felt the absence of the packet and the presence of everything he had written. He did not speak as a man escorted by guards was pulled away. Instead, he made the ledger his instrument and his witness. He had started as a recorder. He had finished the day a keeper of consequences. He folded the ledger and tucked his pen away. Then he walked toward the gate, toward the courier road and the world outside the wire, carrying the memory of names, the ink of decisions, and the quiet weight of betrayal turned into duty. He walked on, and the final act he took that evening, to place the sealed packet into a hollow and then to hand it on through Petrov's furtive care, remained a concrete motion binding paper to possible justice. The yard emptied, the snow hid footprints. He buttoned his coat and left, the ledger pressed against his chest and the camp's last noise fading behind him as the gate groaned closed.